Good morning and welcome back to the Global Boardroom. I'm Chris Giles, the economics editor of the Financial Times, and it's my great pleasure to have a chance to talk with Ravi Menon, the Managing Director of the Monetary Authority of Singapore. Ravi's been the Managing Director of the MAS since 2011, and before that a senior official in Singapore's government and its central bank. This therefore is someone who has a first-hand knowledge of the economic outlook for the Asia-Pacific region and crucially, the need to build sustainability into economic policy in the years ahead. I'd like to reiterate to you, the audience, you're part of this conversation, even though this has been recorded. So please share your thoughts and tweets on social media using the hashtag #FTGlobalBoardroom. Ravi, before we move on to the issues of sustainability, could you first set the scene and give us your perspective of the economic outlook for the Asia-Pacific region as the global economy begins to recover from the pandemic?
Yes. Well, first, thank you, Chris. Thank you for having me on this FT Global Boardroom. Happy to be here and to connect with you. So I think the larger backdrop is for the outlook for Asia Pacific is what has happened last year. And I think to begin with, the Asia Pacific in aggregate suffered a milder recession than virtually every other region in the world. By Asia Pacific, I mean Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, China, and the 5 countries of ASEAN, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, and Singapore, and Australia and New Zealand. Contracted by something like less than 0.5%, taking the whole of 2020. Whereas most of the regions contracted by -2%, -7%. 3 reasons. One, China shot up the region basically. China recovered first off the block very quickly, quickly got to pre-COVID levels and registered positive growth last year. And that has been a powerful locomotive for the region. Second, the export-driven sector of the Asia Pacific has recovered quite nicely with the rather rapid restoration of supply chains, which was seriously disrupted in the first 2 quarters of last year. So this has been quite a nice spring back in manufacturing, and that continues to be sustained into this year. Third, of course, is that the infection rates, the COVID-19 infection rates in the Asia Pacific has been significantly lower than in other parts of the world. And this has helped considerably in partial reopening of the economies and bringing back some degree of demand to domestic services, all of which has helped. So looking ahead, I think there will be a pickup in the growth momentum. We are seeing signs of that already in the first quarter. And I would expect the outperformance in the Asia Pacific region to continue into next year, through the rest of this year, I'd say. 6.5% growth, that's our forecast for the region this year, which is not too bad. And there'll be quite a bit of tailwind coming from manufacturing especially. But this is not to say that there are serious uncertainties and risks still on the horizon. The situation in India is deeply worrying, and it's got implications for the rest of the world, both by way of infection rates coming up again in other parts of the world, as well as supply of vaccines from India. And the other thing is that the vaccine deployment in the Asia Pacific has been relatively slower, perhaps because infection rates are lower. There's not been as much urgency. In Singapore, we're pushing ahead full steam, but in other parts of the region, for a variety of reasons, vaccine deployment has not been as rapid. And that does leave the region a little vulnerable if there's a renewed outbreak on the scale that we saw last year.
Well, that's in lots of ways, I mean, a relatively optimistic picture. I think it matches with a lot of what we've seen recently from the International Monetary Fund and other big global bodies saying that actually now we have vaccines on the horizon and we have, in many regions, in particular Asia Pacific, an ability or has been an ability to control the virus. Some of the longer term scarring and consequences for the economic, for the economic well-being, doesn't look quite as bad as it did in the middle of last year or this time a year ago. So let's I mean, I totally understand the risks you were pointing out, and let's put the risks to one side for a second and just now look to the longer term, assuming that the pandemic is controlled, although I totally understand that there are reasons why we might be a bit more worried about that. What are the most important challenges for the long term in the Asia Pacific region, and particularly in promoting sustainability for the region?
I think the challenges remain pretty much the same as they were pre-COVID. I guess the urgency to act, the imperative and importance have grown substantially since the pandemic. The march towards digitalization of the economies, to creating truly digital and connected economies in the Asia Pacific, that's become vitally important. A great scope for e-commerce, application of technologies, and so on. And associated with that is the reskilling of the workforce, continued investments in digital infrastructure, and reskilling the workforce. And of course, to ensure that development is on a sustainable path. And this doesn't bear repeating, but basically I think we've seen since last year a strong resurgence in interest and consciousness about the need to create a more sustainable planet, about the need to mitigate carbon emissions and so on. I see this in all my conversations. And even in Asia, that's risen to policymakers' priority list. And that will be one of the big challenges that Asia needs to address. Asia accounts for nearly half of global carbon emissions. And yet Asia is not where Europe and America are with respect to social and economic development. There's still ongoing rapid urbanization and so on. To make that the transition challenges, I think, are going to be the most significant. The trade-offs are sharper in Asia than in the developed economies. So I'd say that will be one of the most important challenges lying ahead.
What role here do you think finance can play, and particularly as a central bank, the Monetary Authority of Singapore? What role do you have particularly to generate or encourage and push finance to helping Asian countries develop in a more sustainable way?
Well, I think as I said, the Asian challenge is one of transition. And I think financing as a tool to spur transition is going to be very, very important. MAS has three distinct roles as a regulator of the financial system, as a investor, because we manage the country's official foreign reserves, and as a developer. We have a mandate to promote Singapore as a financial center supporting the growth of Asia. So as a regulator, we are, of course, very concerned about the resilience of the financial system to climate-associated risks. And we want to make sure that our financial institutions are prepared. Firstly, they are knowledgeable about the risks and their exposures to climate events and risks, both the physical risks as well as the transition risks, changes in carbon prices or taxes, technological breakthroughs in renewables, for instance. These are factors that can affect the portfolio of financial institutions quite significantly, be it the loans you've extended, the bonds you've issued, the insurance coverage you've provided, or your investment portfolio. So this is an important exercise that we're engaged in with the financial institutions. We've issued a set of environmental risk management guidelines and that applies to all financial institutions, not just the banks, also to insurance companies and asset managers. And we're working closely with them to come up with scenarios and then to conduct an industry-wide stress test based on these scenarios. In matters of the climate, it's not going to be, I think it's virtually impossible to predict what will happen. I think the approach we need to take is one of scenario planning where we chart distinct scenarios and ask ourselves, under each of these scenarios, what's the impact on my exposures and on my portfolios? And that's what we're gearing up the financial sector for. As an investor, sorry, go ahead, Chris, you wanted to say something?
Would you expect, when you do these stress tests, would you expect actual changes need to be made, that the financial institutions, whether it's the banks or the insurance companies, will find that they have, let's say, in certain scenarios, too many assets in dirty or brown investments, and therefore you will, as an authority, say you really need to think about this in certain scenarios where, let's say, there's a big technological breakthrough in renewables, these assets will become stranded and effectively worthless. Is that your expectation at the end of this process?
Yes, absolutely. I think certainly in terms of our supervisory approach, those are the kinds of conversations we'll be having. If the stress test results show that under certain assumptions, part of the portfolio is likely to get stranded, then we engage in a conversation as to, so how are we going to mitigate this risk? It's no different from a regular stress test. You know, if there was a global recession, how are you going to manage your portfolio? Have you taken mitigating measures? So those kinds of conversations are going to be very, very important. I'm drawing a distinction between supervision and regulation. Regulation is where you set capital or liquidity standards and so on. I think it's still early days. We don't have enough data to make that kind of distinction between green assets and brown assets. MAS is leading some of the initiatives at the Global Network for Greening the Financial System, which comprises a number of central banks and regulators. And there we are studying the potential financial risk differentials from a quantitative angle between green and brown assets. As you can understand, the data doesn't go back far enough to make firm conclusions. But I think this work will gather steam and momentum in the years ahead. I would not rule out some kind of regulatory differential between different kinds of assets, but we don't need to wait for that. I think if the stress test shows that there's going to be some damage, then we got to engage in that conversation about how you're going to manage your risk. But it's a supervisory process and not a rule-based process.
So that's supervision, and I think I cut you off where you were going to say you had two other roles in the MAS, one as an investor and one as a developer. So do you want to say how you use those two other tools in your armory for sustainability too?
Yeah. But one last item as a regulator, I think I spoke mostly from the perspective of a safety and soundness and risk management. But we're also a securities regulator in the MAS. And so we are also looking to strengthen disclosure practices for listed issuers and financial institutions. I think this is one of the big lacunas in the global efforts on sustainable finance. We just don't have enough information. I mean, you want to use financing tools to spur the right behavior, but if you can't measure the behavior, you can't measure the current footprint, carbon footprint, you can't measure the effectiveness of abatement measures, it becomes difficult to impose that financial discipline. So we need to get taxonomies sorted out. Two, we need to get data measurements sorted out, certain consistency, and we need to get disclosure strengthened. And all three needs to go together so that you can make comparisons. And once there's good disclosure, then there can be good market discipline and financial incentives. And so as a securities regulator, that's something we're very keenly focused on. So moving on to our role as an investor, well, we manage the official foreign reserves with the objective of preserving its long-term purchasing power. But we're also looking to build a climate resilient portfolio and how we can use our investments as a nudge towards the green finance agenda. So we are not, as a central bank, we can't be an impact investor in the traditional sense. But what we have done is to set aside $2 billion US, which we have given out to external fund managers who demonstrate a very high capability in green investing, either directly through their investment strategies or through their stewardship and actions as an active investor. So we work through the external fund managers who then know, who have specific expertise in different sectors, different geographies, and work through them. And where we look at whether they continue to deliver us good returns, but also make an impact on corporates and investee companies with respect to making the transition towards greater sustainability. Now, $2 billion is not going to move the needle in Asia, but it's not that small either. It's good enough to get quite a few asset management firms to come to Singapore, expand their ESG teams, build capabilities, understand the peculiarities of different sectors, and to be able to work with these investee companies with respect to making the transition. So this is going to be a long-term effort, as you fully appreciate. But as an investor, we thought that's one thing we could do using our resources. Last, as a developer, we're quite unusual, I know. Most regulators do not have a function to develop their financial sectors, and that's, there's an obvious conflict of interest. But MAS has been doing this the last 50 years, and I should say not too badly. And because we have this role, it also makes it easy for us to incentivize green finance solutions to meet the region's needs. So we have launched a sustainable bond grant scheme where we give a grant for those issuers who make issuances for bonds that meet international standards for sustainability. We have green and sustainability linked loan grant scheme. We've encouraged the setting up of sustainable green financing platforms. For small and medium enterprises, it can be quite difficult to assess how green they are. And so some of these generalized frameworks can help to do that. And we've seen a good pickup from not just local banks and regional banks, but actually the European banks who have a strong presence in Singapore and also have deep expertise in these areas. And we see more of them bringing the ESG teams to the region to take advantage of some of these financing solutions. We're also looking at the insurance sector and the catastrophe bonds and investment-linked securities issuance. So we're trying to take a comprehensive ecosystem view, lending, investing, insurance, and getting some incentives to nudge financial institutions in this direction. And anyway, managing climate risk is actually central to financial sector's mandate. They do need to manage this risk. So it's not something that's alien.
Of course, in the end, if they're sufficiently long-sighted, they know this is existential for their own companies. But the trouble with finance quite often is it's not sufficiently long-sighted. And I suppose also that if you, as the MAS, are providing quite a lot of money as a developer or as an investor, there is a risk that, especially without, as you said, full disclosure and a full taxonomy of what really matters for climate, there's a risk that you will attract people because of the money who will effectively engage in quite a lot of greenwashing, things that look sustainable, that feel sustainable, but actually don't really do anything for the climate or do much less than is promised. What's your safeguards against that? What sort of things are you going to put in place to minimize? There's obviously a risk to minimize that risk.
Yeah, that's a good question, and that's something that in a sense, concerns us deeply too. And because as a regulator and central bank, there are reputational implications if we get this wrong. Which is why we need to build a whole ecosystem of green finance, which includes external validation, certification and rating services. And so the likes of Moody's and so on, to put their ESG teams here and to make independent assessments about the activities of financial institutions. I think most financial institutions are well-intentioned about this, but probably don't have the full capabilities to see through the supply chain and to see beyond the project to the issuer and make a determination as to how green the borrower is. And that's a capability that needs to be built up. And so again, that's an activity we are promoting. And they also need to rely on third-party service providers who have deep expertise in this. I think technology is another way in which we're going to be able to address this. Very often we have great difficulty in seeing through the supply chain. And I think we need to invest in technologies like IoT devices, which can monitor the actual energy efficiency or carbon emissions. Satellite photography is quite useful for nature-based solutions, forestation issues, and so on. We need a way in which we can trust the integrity of the data that's being provided. And so we are also experimenting with blockchains and distributed ledger systems where there is mutual and decentralized verification of data, and the data can be trusted and secured. And because there will be multiple parties relying on this data to make financing decisions, the integrity of such platforms are important. So one of the projects that we've launched together with the industry is Project Greenprint, where first is a platform which tries to connect people seeking green financing, be they small and medium enterprises or so on, or projects, and financiers who are looking for opportunities. And digital platforms are a wonderful way that cuts down on geographical boundaries and connects people across Asia. But more importantly, we are trying to inject some of these technologies that I spoke about, which can help to monitor carbon footprints, monitor the effectiveness of abatement measures, and highlight problems or issues that are emerging. So no single solution. It's not going to be solved completely. And as you correctly pointed out, every good thing you do carries with it some risk. And so we have to bear some of this risk. But we do our best to use technology, to use third-party independent assessments, and just building up capabilities. You've got to keep building up capabilities in this. Compared to 3 years ago, I think we're all a lot more knowledgeable. We're also a lot more knowledgeable about what we don't know and trying to raise the game. So I think if you do a combination of these, we can manage the risks of greenwashing.
You've talked a bit about technology there in that answer. One of the technologies that seen globally as something that might be very effective is some form of market pricing for carbon. In what way do you think both carbon markets can help the transition to a low carbon environment, and also specifically what can you do in Singapore to foster that as a basis for sustainability?
Indeed. I think getting a right price for carbon is going to be critical before any of these technologies can come in. And so I think there has to be a global movement towards carbon taxation or some form of offset system. And once the price is at an appropriate level, it will start generating the incentives. So Singapore is the first country in Asia to implement a carbon tax. It's a very small tax. It's just $5. It's just to see how it works. We've already indicated the intention to progressively increase this. We just got to make sure we've turned the corner on COVID-19. But the direction of movement is very clear. That's one. Second, as I mentioned earlier on, Asia's challenge is transition. We are going to have to rely on some kinds of fossil fuels for a bit longer. So the challenge here is not to move to an absolute standard of green in one bound, but to progressively move through deeper shades of green from where they are. 45 million people in Southeast Asia do not have access to electricity. Many more millions do not have access to good drinking water. Now, the investments required to bring clean water and electricity to these people are going to involve some carbon intensive activities. So I think the challenge here is to have a mechanism to shift them towards greener sources, not in one leap, but perhaps to natural gas from coal, and then from natural gas to renewables. In the meanwhile, there will be a great demand because there will be some sectors that will be more advanced in being able to reduce their carbon footprint and others less so. I think there is scope for an active voluntary carbon credits market in Asia. It's probably going to grow several times. So as a financial and business center, we also want to be a carbon services hub where we can create high quality credits for decarbonization and have a trading mechanism where those who need those credits can then buy them. But all this requires a good carbon price and infrastructure that brings together the demand and supply. And I think most important, a way to verify the quality of the credits generated. Unfortunately, because of greenwashing, some of the credits that have been generated in the past do not pass muster. And they're adding to the problem rather than bringing about greater sustainability. So we need to establish strong standards, verifications, and make sure that the carbon credits that are being generated and traded are of high quality. A last point on this, I'd say in Asia, one untapped potential is in nature-based solutions. Southeast Asia is the largest mangroves in the world, lots of forests. The oceans also offer great opportunity to act as carbon sinks, which removes carbon from the environment, even as development and urbanization emits carbon into the atmosphere. So I think in Asia, you're going to see this. Now, to incentivize, measure, and promote nature-based solutions of this sort, we need to build new capabilities. They don't exist today. Measuring it is very difficult. The carbon credits market in this space is not well developed. And that's something we are quite focused on as potentially a big needle mover in Asia.
Well, Ravi Menon, thank you very much. It's a big agenda of work ahead on the sustainability front, both outside the organization to get a proper carbon price so that then the financial sector can operate, but also in combating greenwashing, as you say, and generating the markets that can help us get progressively towards a greener future. You've been incredibly clear and incredibly kind with your time this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. Bye.